Hello everyone, this is my latest quilt. It started with this drawing for the motifs, and then the second drawing to add an idea for the borders. This is the finished quilt. I always like to see the finished quilt before I go into how I did it, because I think then you'll see what the next hour is going to entail. You'll see that we created all kinds of cool design motifs, and in the body of the quilt we created secondary designs by adding dividing lines, the feather motifs with the pebbles and recreating that flower center, cool border treatments. So we'll go through all of this in the course of this next hour. So we start out with the body of the quilt and creating the secondary design, which the first thing I did was create the square on point, and then used a template for that, and used a template for creating the circles. And see that pink flower in the middle with the print in the middle of that? We're going to recreate that just in stitching and around the border of the body, not in the borders, but in the border of the body. And I'll show you how I did that. This quilt, it is quite puffy. I use 2 layers of batting. I like Quilter's Dream, which is almost exclusively what I use. I use Quilter's Dream Orient, which is a silk bamboo blend, and then a layer of wool on top of that. So I think one of the more difficult aspects of this quilt was just managing that extra fullness that the 2 layers of the batting creates. But and how I handled that was my first pass through the quilt. I used monofilament thread, the clear thread, the invisible thread, to stitch in the ditch around all the applique, around the flying geese and the borders, and of course around the outside of the quilt. Having done that, that allows me then to roll the quilt back and forth as needed because it's now stable. So with that done, with this quilt stabilized then, the first thing I did was create these secondary designs. I had found actually a cutting template that was about the size that I wanted for creating these squares on point. And I found that template while I was doing the drawing. So I like to draw my designs in actual size, because then I can pick out the appropriate templates or rulers that will help me then recreate what I drew on the actual quilt. And you'll see further down how I did that. Isn't that pretty? So I am talking to you here as I myself am watching this video. I have decided to add narration at the end, so it cuts out all the background noise. You won't get noise from the machine, which in my past videos has been kind of difficult to hear over. So flowers, pebbles, circles, and you can see with that burgundy flower, oh, there's the template. It's actually a cutting template that I use for just marking. I use an air erasable marker, you know, the air pens, the purple pens, with just doing a slight little line right at the corners. See, right there, just at the corner, and then at the end, where the line meets the border. I don't quilt with this, mostly because it's too thin. Yeah, there's the disappearing ink. It's the air erase marker, the purple pen. I use purple pen and I use chalk. Those are about the only two marking tools that I use anymore, because on customer quilts anyway, because it's too much of a, see, there's the difference. Sorry, I'm going back and forth. See, the top is a 1/4 inch thick quilting ruler or quilting template, and the bottom one is just a regular cutting template. So the difference in the thickness is why I only use that cutting template to mark with. And I used that because it was the perfect size and I didn't have to measure. I could just draw some lines on it to find my center of the template, and then that allows me to place it properly on the quilt. And then I use my quilting straight edge to actually draw the lines. And I think you can see the two little purple marks there, one near the border by my hopping foot, and one further out. That's really all you need. And those marks will disappear in the summer in a matter of minutes. And in the winter, because there's less humidity, within about a half hour, you can't see any trace of that. And you'll see the little flowers, the little burgundy flowers. They will pop over top of the lines I'm about to quilt. So it gives it kind of a three-dimensional look. So it doesn't matter if the applique kind of creeps into, and you can see me there going right around the applique. It'll make it look like the applique goes over the dividing line. It gives it a dimensional look, which I find really a nice addition to most quilts. So it's a little bit slow going, but that's okay. And I use the seam lines of the piecing in the quilt also to help guide me where my point should be, my stop, my starts. And it's good if you can turn your corner or change direction right on one of those seam lines. It just makes it look nice and square and right where it should be. So I'm going right around. And then I'm going to echo that line on the way back. And echoing is good because it gives definition. So no matter how much more quilting we add to this quilt, and you'll see by the end this quilt will have been quilted to death, it will give definition to those dividing lines and make them stand out even in a fully quilted quilt. So where you want to accentuate something, you want to make sure you're going to put in an echo line. So I did stitch in the ditch around all that applique in my first pass through the quilt. So you can see on the take-up bar where all that's already been stitched in. So now I can roll the quilt back and forth and don't have to worry about anything getting wonky or pleats on the back or anything like that, because it's been nice and stabilized. This is a circle ruler, and again the size I determined when I did my drawing. I found a size that would just look good with the feathers that I'm going to put around it, and there's nothing more than just trial and error. Draw it in different size circles until you get the size that you like. This circle ruler is by Amanda Murphy. She sells these, a bunch of them in her pack. They're extremely competitively priced, and there are you can't buy them individually. You buy like 4 or 5 rulers in the pack. And she has some amazing videos on her website. I've put a link in the comments in the description below. You can get to her website, and she's got some really cool ideas about how to use these rulers, creating different effects on the quilts, and all the lines that she has drawn on the rulers allow you to do some of those awesome effects. Now I just switched to a smaller size ruler. This is a different ruler. It's a smaller diameter. And what I like about her rulers, the lines on them are very helpful in a lot of different instances. But what I also like about her rulers is they're almost solid, which gives you a lot of room to hold on to them. I'm not a fan of nested rulers because there's just not enough to hold on to. Now these feathers are in 4 times regular speed. So no, I don't quilt that fast. But I thought you'd get bored watching this in real time. So portions of this video I've sped up. I wish I could do pebbles that quickly, but that's okay. So I use the pebbles. It just adds more interest, but it also gives me a chance to get back to my starting point and then do feathers all going in the same direction. This is another one of Amanda's, one of the rulers in that set. Cross hatching in the center of the flower. And this ruler is by the Quilted Pineapple. She has really nice straight rulers. I am marking the little petal shapes of the flowers. And I mark it simply because I want to make sure I get all the petals the same size and the same distance. I don't want to have to ever rip out stitches when I can avoid it. So a little bit of marking just makes that happen. Square ruler. I'm putting smaller squares in between the big squares, again, to create a secondary design and quite practically to take up space that I don't have to worry about filling. So these are nesting rulers, which again I'm not a fan of, but I had them gifted to me. And you use what you have, right? So I don't often use square rulers, but I don't like to measure, and to have to measure points, north, south, east, and west, to mark how big that square needs to be. It's just easier to use a ruler. Now, I made a mistake there, and I didn't edit it out because, everybody makes mistakes, and I make mistakes, but it's okay. It's fixable. You can work with it. You got to do the square before you can do the quilting inside the square, simply because you got to know how far you can go with the quilting inside the square. So quilt the square first. So there we go. And this little square on the edges there is going to disappear behind the big square. Again, it adds to that three-dimensional effect where you have one square kind of scooching behind another square, or one element scooching behind another element of this lovely, beautiful quilt. See, there's just so little to hold on to on these nesting rulers. It's much more difficult, much more wobbly. I just like having more ruler to hold on to. But again, use what you got. Now I'm going to put an echo line around that. And quite often I am asked, do you echo on the inside or the outside? And the answer is, it depends. In this case, I wanted more of that overlap effect. So I echoed on the outside. So more of that little triangle would look like it's overlapping underneath the big triangle. So that's why I did that. case you're curious, it took a little over 27 hours to quilt this quilt. And it was absolute joy every minute of it. It was really cool. About half that time was spent in quilting the fills, which you'll see at the end of the video. We quilted around the applique with McTavishing, and then we added scribbling around all those lovely feathers and pebbles, just to make those feathers and pebbles pop even more. So the McTavishing and the scribbling took altogether a good 13 or more hours. So just for those two fills, it took as much time as it did to do everything else on this quilt. So for the quilting that I do custom quilting. I do edge to edge as well, but predominantly I do custom quilting. And I break that into three categories. Limited custom, which is very budget friendly. Mid-level custom, and then heirloom custom. And this quilt, the end result was heirloom custom. And what differentiates heirloom from mid-level is mostly the extent of the fill work. If we had not done the fills, this would easily have been a mid-level custom quilt, and it would have been beautiful without those fills. As you can see, just putting in these secondary designs with the squares and the feathers and the pebbles, that if we had done the whole quilt with that and not added the fills, this would have been a very beautiful mid-level custom quilt. But adding those fills truly gives it an heirloom effect and an heirloom price. So I've sped it up. Thought maybe you'd want to see it again, how I did that. Oh, I don't know what else to tell you. Feathers. If you're interested in learning how to do feathers, I think the best teacher that I have come across for doing feathers is Beth Ann Nimish. She has a Feather Fiesta class, among other classes. She is an amazing teacher, and I have learned to do feathers by taking a number of her classes. Now you'll see I put the little square design into the border as well. And that means not into the border, on the border of the border. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. Which means I just divide the design in half and just quilt half of it. To do this, I quilted all the big triangles first, and then I went back and quilted the little, I quilted the big squares, and then I went back and quilted the little squares, because the little squares, again, scooch in behind the big squares, so the big squares had to be there first. And I do one row at a time, advance the quilt, do the next row, do the big squares, do the little squares, advance the quilt, and so on. You see, that looks pretty just with that secondary design. Now we're at the top of the body here, and you'll see how I do those dividing lines again. See, it looks pretty. It's pretty with just the applique, and it would have been beautiful just to put a fill all around that whole body without doing the secondary design. In fact, doing McTavishing on a larger scale than what I'm going to show you at the end here, or to do nemishing, which is Beth Ann Nemish, her signature fill. That would also have been beautiful. Actually, to cross hatch throughout this whole body, if you quilt on a domestic and you want to quilt with a ruler foot, mark your lines. You know, if you do them an inch apart, do them on a diagonal, and just use your ruler foot. You could quilt a quilt this size beautifully on a domestic with just a ruler foot. Now, I said before, I do one entire row at a time. So basically the first step is I mark the corners of my big triangles. And again, I'm using that cutting template because it's the right size. It just happened to be the size that I like without having to move it. So I am marking the corners of my square. And so again, I'm sorry, I digress. You could do this on a domestic. If you have just a domestic, I would recommend marking your lines and then using your walking foot to do the straight lines. There's my little purple air erase mark. And I chose to put the ruler on the mark. Do you put the ruler on the mark, or do you put the presser foot on the mark? Well, the answer to that is basically, how big do you want your square? So I didn't want the square I wanted it just to touch the applique, just to show a little bit of an overlap. And I found that size ruler, if I put the straight edge on the mark and then quilted the 1/4 inch inside of that, would give me the perfect dimension. Again, these are 2 different size circle rulers and the third size circle ruler to get all my dividing lines done first. And then we add the design motifs, the cross hatching, the pearls, the feathers, and the petals. We're mimicking the pebbles. Again, I mark them to make sure they're all appropriately the same size. I don't like to rip out stitching. And this is 4 times normal speed. Again, the feathers, I wanted them to look like they were just disappearing underneath the border. So that's 1/4 of a motif. And a little triangle would go right there. So we're doing a little square would go there. We'll do the big square first, because that'll define where the little one will go. And I'm scooching around the applique. A bigger circle. I use the ditch to travel so I don't have to break thread so often, which on the outside of the quilt, along the border there, it's easy to do because I can just travel in the border. I didn't have to break thread at all. It was really nice. I use the lines on the ruler to make sure that my stitch lines are perpendicular so that I get nice perfect squares on point to create that cross hatching. Use the lines on your ruler if you're a quilter, use your lines on your ruler to do that. It's pretty easy. Or if you're not comfortable with that, just mark it. Draw it first. Even with the air erase, if you draw it before, as you go, you know, because again, air erase, if it's your own quilt and you're confident that that you're going to wash the quilt and you won't get any colors running or anything like that, use the blue marker, the wash away marking pen, and then just wash your quilt at the end. But I've not had any issues with the blue Marks Be Gone by Clover, the blue wash away pen. That's come out in every case, but I only use it on my own quilts, and I wash my quilts when they're all done. So with that washing, all the marks have come out cleanly and completely. On a customer quilt, I just hesitate using anything but the air erase pen, or on a dark quilt with white chalk, because for one, I'm not familiar with their fabric, and even if you do a pre-test and it comes out, when you're dealing with a customer quilt and you have a variety of different fabrics, the fabric itself, when you spritz it, or with water, you can't wash a customer quilt, but if you spritz it with water, it may come out, but will it make the colors run? Like for instance on this quilt, you have burgundy, you have gold, you have green. If I spritz near any of those colors, especially anything red, are they gonna bleed? So on a customer quilt, I hesitate using even the blue wash away pen, because I am afraid, if those colors bleed, it's my fault. If the customer washes it and the colors bleed, it's not my fault. So I am just very careful about what marking tools I use. I use as little as possible. And again, when I do, it's either the air erase or white chalk on a darker quilt. So I try to choose designs that are not so elaborate, that I can get away with just a minimal amount of marking. And next up, we're going to do the inner and outer border, those two narrow borders. I decided to do echo lines on the inner border on both sides of the border, and then put piano keys in between the echo lines. Just a stunning look for this quilt. I'm using Lisa Calais Quilters Groove, that's her brand name, Quilters Groove ProLine 2 ruler. 2 being it makes 1/2 inch wide piano keys. And this is a wonderful ruler to use, especially if you're traveling in the ditch on both sides. I don't know about you, but my brain can only handle so much at a time. So if I don't have to worry about how far to advance, I can just look at the echo lines and make sure that I'm traveling in that ditch and not wiggling out of the ditch. I don't have to worry about thinking about how far do I need to go. I can just go until I bump into the ruler, and it makes it very easy, very quick to do piano keys. Or you can use this ruler for cross hatching too. Again, I have a variety of rulers, and it just whatever in the moment makes it easiest for me to quickly and accurately quilt something. That's the ruler I grab. And I do like these ProLine rulers. So lisahcalais.com. I put a link in the description. So I'm at the bottom of the quilt, and I'm doing the bottom of this border. And this is 4 times regular speed, but you can see it goes relatively quickly. And so I can do, even on the sides, I will do the depth of my machine, from the take-up roller up to the front of the machine. I'll do the echo lines, come down one side, go up the other, and then come back down to do the piano keys, and that allows me to travel one section at a time. That way I don't have to roll the quilt so off. But this goes quickly, and with this ruler, again, I don't have to think about that many things. Now I'm using just Quilted Pineapple's small straight edge ruler to do the outer border. One, because on that top border, the ProLine ruler won't fit. It's too close to my red snappers. So that's the first reason why I switched to just the straight edge ruler. But then also, I'm only doing an echo on the inner part of this border. I don't have to do it on the outside because your binding is going to be there, and the binding is going to mimic that echo line on the outside. So you'll notice I am coming in, going out, traveling forward, in, out, forward, in, out, forward, in, out, forward. The reason I'm going in, out, and forward is because with just that straight ruler, it just got it's too much to think about, staying on that echo line and making sure I only go a ½ inch at a time. It's just too much to think about. So it was easier just to go in and out and travel on the outside seam line. So we moved on to doing the wide border, and this is just a cool little design for the corners because it had a little extra space, and I want to stay with the motifs that I have in the body of the quilt. So I have echoes in the body of the quilt. I have pebbles in the body of the quilt. And I just found a way that looks attractive to mimic that in the border. I think it just pulls the whole quilt together when you can do things in the border or use elements in your borders that you've already used in the body of the quilt. Funny thing about these corner blocks, I'm going to fess up here. Each one of these corner blocks, each of the 4 corner blocks in this quilt are a little bit different. And I'm going to say that was a design choice, but in actuality, it was a screw up. The first block that I did, the first corner block that I did it wrong. I did it, well, I'll put it this way. I did it in a way that I didn't intend to do it. I wanted to put a circle of pebbles inside each corner block, and the first one I did, I totally forgot about that. And I did the circle, I did a wreath with feathers on the inside and outside, and I totally forgot about the ring of pebbles. So you'll see on the end, I show the corners, all 4 corners in the end. If you notice, they're all different. But they work because they're all intentionally different, so that mistake became a design decision, a design choice. And it looks great. So if you make a mistake on your quilt and your stitching is good, your tension is good, your stitch quality is good, the only thing you did wrong was just quilt something wrong, just make it a design choice by repeating that mistake somewhere else in the quilt. So I'll get off my soapbox. I hate ripping out stitches. I have no problem ripping out stitches if the quality of the stitch is bad, but I will do everything possible to avoid ripping out quality stitches. So in this corner, I marked the center of it, but in this corner, I think you'll see that I will put the pebbles in place. So a typical wreath, feather wreath, I'm going to do the outside feathers first. Very carefully. My backtracking on my feathers is getting really good. I rarely miss backtracking properly. I'm very proud of that. I will admit it. I am very proud of that. So at the end of this quilt, I suggested to my customer that maybe you want scribbling around the outside of your feathers and around your pebbles just to make them pop a little bit more and accentuate them a little bit more. And as soon as I had made the decision, or as soon as I made that suggestion, the thought came to my head, oh man, they're not going to be able to see how perfect your backtracking is. So if your backtracking is not what you would like it to be, and I will admit mine was not what I would like it to be, and when I started scribbling in the beginning, when I was doing feathers, I had missed the mark on a number of my backtracks. I would just scribble around the outside of the feathers and cover up the mistake. And it would look perfect. It would look beautiful. It took a little bit extra work, extra time, because the scribbling you'll see in the end is very time intensive. You have to really commit to doing that, especially on a quilt this size. But it is an amazing way to cover up all your flaws. So if you're a beginner, and you want to put your best foot forward, there is nothing wrong with figuring out ways to cover up your flaws and make your quilts look amazing as if you were an expert by doing this. And this is not an original thought by me. This I have heard from a number of international award-winning quilters. They will even admit that it's not so much that their quilting is that much better than all the other people who enter the quilt contest. It's just a matter that they have figured out how to hide their flaws more effectively than everyone else. So if you're not an exemplary quilter, and I am not an exemplary quilter, I am pretty good, striving to get better, but there are always ways that you can figure out how to hide something that maybe isn't as perfect as you'd like it to be. So if you're starting out as a quilter, just remember that. Don't beat yourself up. Nobody is perfect, not even some of these amazing quilters that win contests all over the world. They've just figured out how to make their work look better, cover their flaws in ways that other people haven't figured out yet. Okay, off my other soapbox. Now we're quilting. Now I'm going around the entire quilt and I'm quilting these center pieces in these flying geese with the echo and the feathers. I decided to add the echo because these geese, the points are perfect. And anytime you want to highlight a piecer's perfection is to echo it. That just points it out. The lady that pieced this, my customer, did an amazing job piecing this. This quilt is beautifully, beautifully pieced. The applique is gorgeous. These flying geese are gorgeous. Um, the only suggestion I would have is if you're quilting, the one thing in this quilt that maybe could have been done differently from a piecer's perspective is that the person who pieced this pressed their fabric into the flying segments, and not into the darker, smaller borders, which caused a lot of buildup in those corners. And you'll see where I didn't quite get, well, that bulk and piecing pushed my hopping foot ever so slightly, but enough that if you look at it at the right angle, you can see that. So my word of advice to a quilter who's piecing, please, please, please make your seams as flat as possible. Press them in a way that there you have the least amount of buildup. Okay? So in these center triangles that change the direction of the flying geese, it's a big enough square that whatever I put in here is going to really stand out. So to do another wreath, that was my first thought, but when I looked at the scale of my feathers, I knew I couldn't do a true wreath with the feathers on the inside and on the outside. So I used this ruler by Deloa, you can see that right there, to create a perfect circle in the center. Because that perfect circle, although it takes more time than to just freehand it, that perfect circle is going to make everything else I do in that square look perfect. So for free motion quilting, rarely is anything I do, I'll speak for myself here, going to be perfect. I don't expect myself to quilt like someone who has a computerized system. And if you're a quilter and you're a free motion quilter especially, please don't expect yourself to quilt like someone who has a computerized system. It's just not going to happen. It's just, you're not a robot. You just, well, I'll stop there. So with free motion quilting, you have fine things that will catch the eye and make something stand out as being really on point, so that that one thing that's on point is just on point, meaning perfect. In this case, the center circle is going to make the feathers that go around it look at just 100 times better than they would have been if I had done that circle freehand. Again, one tiny little mark in the center of that circle to find the center of the circle so I can perfectly center this motif. But adding that circle right in the center there just makes that whole simple little feather design just stand out and go, wow, how cool is that? So here's one of the other corners. I thought I'd show you since I fessed up that all those corner blocks are slightly different. So in the one that we did before, I did the feathers on the outside, and then the pebbles and the feathers that went on the inside. In this one, you'll see I'm only going to do some cross hatching. Again, picking an element from the body of the quilt and putting it in the border. So in this quilt, I use echoing, I use feathers, I use pebbles, I use cross hatching and piano keys, and that's about it. 5 simple little designs that tie this whole quilt together and make it look stunning. The fills, there are only 2 fills. You'll see later, McTavishing and the scribbling. And when you think about breaking this down into just those little segments, this quilt, if you look at it finished, you can say, oh, wow. I would look at that finished quilt and say, oh, holy cow, I can't do that. And probably a year ago, I would have said, oh, shit, sorry, I can't do that. But if you break it down into its elements, Lisa Calais has an awesome class. She calls it her Heirloom Quilting Academy. I put a link to her website in the description. But in that class, she teaches all about creating secondary designs in any size quilt, using dividing lines as step one, and then adding design motifs such as feathers, pebbles, that kind of thing, and step two, and then adding your fills in step three. Having taken that class, I now look at quilts in that way. I mean, that's an awesome system to look at a quilt. You look at all that open space and say, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Well, you create those dividing lines and break it down into manageable, doable, quiltable segments that you can quilt even on a domestic, because once you break it down into those manageable chunks, you can quilt this on a long arm or a domestic. Now here we're starting with one of the two fills. This is McTavishing, or at least it's my version of McTavishing. Karen McTavish has an amazing book that contains a couple videos in which she shows how to do this. And basically she breaks it down into doing sets of funky shaped S-curves. They're basically S-curves that go in all wonky directions, and then fills in between the S-curves with C-shapes, which in my version of this, I fill in with C-shapes. There's her book. That's the book I got. That's the book that I learned from. I found a bunch of videos on YouTube for how to do McTavishing, but they weren't her version. They were other people's takes on her version. And when I found that book, it really taught me how to do this. And pretty much the only way I deviate, I do the wonky shaped S-curves like that. And then the fills in between, I expanded it to not just C shapes, but to pebbles, to feather fronds, to swirls, I've even put in teeny tiny little leaves, depending on what the quilt is. But basically, McTavishing is this funky S shape, which divides a big space into a little space, and then you fill that little space with C shapes or whatever comes to mind. Now, speeded up version here. Now, throughout the quilt, doing the feathers, doing the dividing lines, and all that, I used 40 weight thread. Doing this McTavishing and the scribbling, I switched to 100 weight thread. With McTavishing especially, the one thing that you don't want is a lot of thread buildup. You only want to see the texture, and in order to just see the texture, you want to use the thinnest thread possible. So I used 100 weight Invisifil in this case, in a blending color, in a cream color to blend with the background. And I use MagnaGlide bobbins in my bobbin. I use MagnaGlide magnetic bobbins, which are a 60 weight bobbin, and I don't change those. I change the color, but I use that for everything, whether 40 weight thread or 100 weight thread, it doesn't matter. So when you're doing this McTavishing, use the thinnest thread possible. And if you don't believe me, take a piece and do the McTavishing with 40 weight thread. or even 50 weight thread, and then do the same thing with 100 weight thread. And you'd be amazed at the difference. There can be a considerable amount of thread buildup because you're doing a lot of traveling with this McTavishing. And I would say, aside from using the really thin thread, you're going to get thread breaks because that's the downside to fills, especially with a 100 weight thread. Just be prepared. You're going to get thread breaks. But, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, with the McTavishing, aside from using the 100 weight thread, the other thing that's, I think, really important is to make sure you keep your density the same. The density being the distance between your stitch lines. If you have really open space, that's going to pop out. And it may pop out in an area where it detracts rather than adds to the quilting. So just watch your density and keep that as consistent as you can. So we'll travel quite a bit. You don't want to break thread with McTavishing. That thread is thin enough. So I finished the body of the quilt with the McTavishing. And again, what you do in the body, I like to do in the border. So adding the McTavishing on the wings of these flying geese blocks just made a stunning effect. And if you're doing this, if you're doing the McTavishing, my other piece of advice is don't overthink it. Just let your mind go. Do your funky S curves and then pick a fill and just move on. Funky S curves, fill the spaces you create, do some more funky S curves and divide your space. Fill it with whatever fill comes to mind. And look how good that McTavishing looks in that border. It's just really, really cool. So now the last part of this quilt, the scribbling. No, I'm still using 100 weight thread. Notice I changed my presser foot to an open toe foot because the last thing you want to do is color outside the lines. You don't want to cross over a boundary stitch line. You don't want to scribble into your feather unless you're fixing a bad backtrack. So I didn't want to screw up a really, really good, nice stitching with coloring outside the line. So if you're doing scribbling, and scribbling is, for me, is just basically loopy, 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 overlapping loops. Teeny tiny little overlapping loops. But look at the definition that adds. Now this quilt is 70 inches by 70 inches. The scribbling alone on this quilt, just scribbling around the feathers and the pearls basically, which you wouldn't think would be that much. I estimated this to be 4 hours. It actually took 6 hours to do the scribbling on this quilt. So if you decide to do scribbling on the bigger quilt, make sure you're committed because it takes an immense amount of time. Beautiful effect, gorgeous effect. Can hide a lot of flaws, can really add amazing three-dimensional texture. You can see in the border, if you look at the feathers and the flying geese in the border, I've already scribbled all around the outside of the border on this quilt. I did that first and then I moved into the body of the quilt. But you can see how that scribbling around those feathers just makes those feathers pop. And in this case, I'm using blending thread on a quilt that has very high loft with the wool batting and the orient batting. But even if your quilt is just cotton batting or just one layer of cotton, one layer of 80-20 or kind of a low loft kind of a quilt, add scribbling with a thread color that's just a shade lighter or darker than your background fabric. The scribbling can add a 3D effect to a puffy quilt, but it can also add a light and shadow effect by just changing up thread. Just if you have a white quilt and just do just a hint of yellow maybe, or a hint of a pastel color, a very, very light pastel color will change, it will give a shadow effect. Oh, sorry, I'm dragging. These are all the different rulers that went into quilting this quilt. I just thought I'd show you. And this is the quilt before I did all the scribbling. And look at how amazing that looks. The back of the quilt, you can see with the puffy, you know, the high loft batting, you can really see the effect. Now this is the finished quilt, trimmed with the scribbling, everything. Does that look amazing or what? And if you're a domestic quilter, you can do this on your domestic. Trust me. I quilted on my domestic for 6 years before I got my long arm. You can do this on a domestic. You just have to mark it completely before you start quilting it. Turned out beautiful. What do you think? So if you are a customer, a piecer, not a quilter, and you would like me to quilt something like this for you, I would love to do that. And if you like this video, please subscribe, give me a thumbs up, add a comment. Let me know what you think of this. I would love some comments. Please, please, please. Thank you.